and I thought I was going to talk a little bit about the different posts in the concept of post-migrant societies, because I actually developed 3 stages of thinking the post-migrant societies, but since quite a couple of time, I'm thinking about a 4th post, and as I haven't published it yet, I thought it would be maybe interesting to just talk to you and think about it, whether this last idea of post will work, and I'm going to talk about it in the end. And it would be the idea, what if the post and post-migrant societies really would mean a kind of end of migration? So what if no migrants would come to Europe anymore? But actually I say this is something I'm just thinking about. I'm thinking it out loud, and I would be happy if we could discuss about it later. But as for today, as for the start, so let me see why this doesn't move. Ah, yeah. Okay. I thought as to the outline, I would talk like about 45 minutes. I heard I have 60, so I can also expand on that. But if not, I think we can take our time to discuss, because actually that's also very interesting for me to hear your thoughts. And I thought I would talk about migration today, as I am heading the German Center for Migration and Integration. My main data that we collect there, it's an empirical institute. We mainly collect data, do surveys. So they're mainly, as you can imagine by the name, concentrated on surveying Germany. But Germany is quite a good example for understanding how countries turn or expand their narratives into becoming countries of immigration, or how they constantly work against it. So I'm talking mainly about Germany, but I think those of you who come from different countries can also relate, and a lot of stuff that is happening in Germany is relatable to other countries and their moments of transformations into countries of immigration too. So I'm going to talk about multi-pluralization of societies, and I'm going to talk about the promise of equality, which I've been working on very much, especially with empirical data. And in the end, I'm going to explore the different ideas of the post and post-migrant. So let's just have a look on migration today. And to start with, I don't know how familiar you are with global migration data, or if you're all migration scholars or working on different angles. But to start with, actually, we have to recognize that most of the people in the world do not migrate. Even though we talk about migration as a very everyday habit, it only affects, in reality, 3.6% of the population. The vast majority of the world continues to live in the countries in which they were born. I think this is very, very important, because we understand the absolute meta-narrative and omnipresence of migration. All of us, we're dealing with it as if migration is like the current stream, and most of the people do migrate, and the others who don't are a kind of rare species. But actually, it's the other way around. Still, migration is very much in the forefront, and still we have the highest numbers of immigrants since World War II. Or migrants, if you want to say. It's not. And we obviously can talk about the fact that you do not have to be a cosmopolitan if you're not a migrant. So you can be a cosmopolitan even if you stay in the place you've been born. And I think we could all connect that very much to digitalization today. But we can leave that for the discussion later. Still, even starting with the fact that migration is still something that affects very, very few people in their lives as immigrants, it obviously affects society very much, because as I mentioned before, you can be impacted by migration too if you have never left the country you've been living in. so dealing with migration for years have been a central source of self-definition in Germany. Already in the 80s, I mean, those of you who are not familiar, Germany started to just hire immigrants to build up the country after World War II. In 1955, Germany did a series of contracts with countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, but also Turkey and Morocco, for example. And since then, it already has been started with the fact whether it would once become a country of immigration or whether it could never turn into a country of immigration. So I just have a couple of citations here. This is the former foreign ministers just stating in the 80s, we are no immigration country. We can't be one because of our size and our population. And then we had in the 90s, the very same narrative of the then Chancellor Helmut Kohl saying Germany is certainly not a country of immigration. And then we had Angela Merkel turning this narrative a little bit into the idea that, well, Germany might have a lot of immigrants, but it is not a classic immigration country. And later on, she even declared multiculturalism as dead. So this was mainly until the 2010 years. So I've been researching a lot those changes in this era of the years, the 2010 years to 2020, when Germany in fact was impacted in 2015 and 16 with a high amount of immigrants coming especially from the Middle East and Africa. So within this decade, so after like 40 years or 50 years nearly of denial, now Germany is standing there as one of the most dynamic immigration and migration actors in the world. So Germany, in fact, has changed its face, and it also has changed its international position. So if you just look at international numbers, Germany ranks second, just after the United States, when it comes to first-generation immigrants. And it also, if you compare it to countries like, let's say, Canada, which we all know as one of the main countries of immigration, as those kind of classic countries of immigration, you can see that Germany in absolute numbers is even ranking higher than Canada. And even when we look at population numbers in terms of percentage, we can see that Germany is even there one of the highest countries impacted by migration in the world. And if we compare the German position in terms of international refugees worldwide, we have to acknowledge that Germany is ranking within the top 5, just right after Turkey and Colombia when it comes to refugee accepting country. In this top 5, you even can't see those kind of classical immigration countries like the US, Canada, or the UK. So in fact, it has changed its worldwide position, but it also has changed the composition of its population very much. So in terms of migration background, nearly 30% of society have a so-called migration background now. This impacts every third family and nearly 40% of children under 18. So we're estimating to hit minority majority ground in 2030 when it comes to children under 18. And we're also in the middle of debating what this means in terms of identity building procedures. So coming to the second part of this keynote, I would want to understand how this like demographical and political face of Germany is somehow reflecting general and generalizable debates on pluralization and blurring boundaries. And I would argue that these are key signatures of all plural democracies. So that's why I thought debates in Germany might be very well relatable to debates in other countries you're coming from or you're researching. We can see that societies are highly divided in terms of their attitudes towards pluralization. So we have pro-pluralization versus anti-pluralization. And we have a lot of research on understanding anti-pluralization sentiments, especially when it comes to right-wing pluralism, like right-wing populism. And we have been experimenting with a lot of assumptions that are thriving anti-pluralization, and I just want to start and introduce some of them. So a lot of people mainly think that rising numbers of immigrants lead to rising effects of anti-pluralization. And we have obviously asked ourselves if rising pluralization lead to something that we call diversity stress on the one side, and plurality resistance alongside with diversity stress. And if the other side, who we call a little bit more open or pro-plural, experience more ambiguity tolerance than the other side. There's a lot of publications on the term of ambiguity and ambiguity tolerance and intolerance. One of the much acclaimed books in Germany is one of my colleague Thomas Bauer on ambiguity tolerance. He mainly writes about the Islamic world and their approach to ambiguity in past centuries. But I think reading that book, which is not a social scientist book, but mainly from a philological angle, might expand our knowledge on how to treat ambiguity and how to understand it in societies that somehow are ethnically and religiously and culturally plural. We also worked on the question whether it's really the rising numbers that lead to these anti-effects, or whether it might be due to a kind of rising hybridization of societies. And this rising hybridization, as I mentioned before, does not have to come hand in hand with migration. You can hybridize societies through digitalization. You can hybridize societies through theoretical expanding thoughts of cosmopolitanism. And you obviously can hybridize societies through kind of debates around gender, around class, and about sexual identity. So we wonder whether blurring identities and ambivalence, and the fact that grouping and belonging become more and more difficult, lead to a kind of higher othering and to higher aversion. We also have worked quite a lot on the hypothesis that rising integration leads to higher distribution conflicts and outgroup mobility threats. I will elaborate on that later. So this might be kind of counter-hypothetic in the first place, because there was a long time this guiding narrative that as long as integration works, the societal problems will become lower and people will embrace pluralization more. But effectively, we can see that rising integration leads to sharper integration debates. I can show you data on that later. We also experiment with the hypothesis, and when I say we, I mean especially me and my colleagues at the German Center for Integration and Migration, and also at the Berlin Center at Humboldt. There at the German Center, there's already like 220 persons working and doing mainly research on these kind of hypotheses, but also a lot on elaborating racism monitor for the German government. So we collect a lot of data and experiment with several ideas to understand, like I think most of you try to understand, how these societies could get divided so much along the line of migration. So we also ask ourselves if rising inequality awareness leads to a kind of normative paradox or to democratic antinomies, and I will also expand on that in this keynote. So starting with pluralization, it's just very important to know that pluralization, as I'm always saying, is not very much connected only to immigration or to migration. So Hannah Arendt has written a lot on pluralization, and to quote her, she said, quote, "Only with things without losing their identity are seen by many in a variety of perspectives, human plurality actually appear. And I further quote her. She says, speaking and acting, human beings actively distinguish themselves from one another rather than merely being different. So pluralization is not only about difference. It's also about different forms of acting, seeing the world, and different forms of appearing in society. And we did one study that we published in 2019 about the post-migrant society, and we wanted to understand if there is a correlation between people who actually fear pluralization and if there is a correlation that can be seen towards anti-immigrant positions. So we just somehow elaborated items on pluralization that were not connected to migration very obviously, like it annoys me that the supermarkets follow every food trend, no more than 2 genders should be officially recognized, marriage for all threatens my understanding of family, or I find it exciting when the German language changes constantly and I learn new words. And I'm not digging very much deeper into that, but you can see that there is quite a constant amount of people somehow rejecting different ideas of pluralization. The highest amount you will see is when it comes to language. So I find it exciting when the German language changes constantly. And those of you who are familiar with the German language and who are familiar with the debates in Germany concerning language, you might know that the language, there is a very, very aversive position towards changing the language in terms of gender neutral or gender equal words. So it doesn't have to do anything with migration, but it's a very aversive position towards integrating words that are somehow connected to gender. So you can also see that this idea of food trends that are annoying, both of these ideas, culture and language and food, are very much related to like cultural changes. They are not directly related to immigration, but my colleague and I expanded on that, and we could clearly find that those within these groups who have this kind of plurality resistance also score decisively higher when it comes to like anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic attitudes. So this might not be very surprising, I suppose, but we just wanted to just somehow correlate it to a generalized resistance towards pluralization of societies. And in my book on the post-migrant society, I worked very much on the idea whether the topos of migration can be seen as a kind of proxy for pluralization. And I told you that coming from Hannah Arendt, plurality is somehow at the one time something that we experience as a kind of empirical description of there is more than what you see, but as well as a normative principle, and Hannah Arendt mainly describes it as a normative principle, while coming from empirical studies, you mainly check numbers to understand if societies are empirically more diverse or not. So I started with the empirical description showing you that Germany has transformed in terms of numbers into a highly migration impacted plural society, but I could also do it coming from a normative principle if we dig into all the debates we have on gender, transgender, class, and different forms of living between the urbans and the rural centers and peripheries. But so understanding that plurality obviously is not only connected to migration, I still expand on my idea that migration has become a kind of a proxy for pluralization. So plurality seems to be somehow seen for a lot of people as a challenge for democracy, and at the same time its empirical basis. So those of you who are familiar with like Putnam's ideas on like bowling alone and the idea of hunkering down of societies. There, the idea of plurality and diversification is very much connected to the idea of societies using trust. But those of you who work on democracy theories, for example, knowing like Dahl's basic ideas on democracy, they also would say that plurality is seen as the main basis of constructing a society that we call democracy. But Dahl expands mainly on the idea of plurality of like legislative pluralities, judicative pluralities, and executive pluralities, and other forms of plural understandings of societies. So we know that plurality on the one side complicates the promise of equality that is given in constitutions when more and more social groups claim equality and access to society. Chantal Mouffe has also expanded on that idea, that there is the idea of equality on the one side, and there is the idea of liberal and freedom on the other side. And also Tocqueville has expanded on that idea that they both somehow contradict each other. But we also know that plurality, as I said, or mentioned Tocqueville already, increases demands for freedom, like more and more social groups claim cultural, ethnic, religious, and sexual rights as part of their religious freedom, for example. So this is also the moment where plurality trades in kind of conflicts into society. And it also obviously threatens the sense of security as more and more social groups demand participation and challenge established access positions and privileges. So secure positions you had in society are somehow also challenged by plurality. So we can say these three main pillars of democracy, like equality, freedom, and security, are effectively changed. So we can understand why people somehow are hesitant and not everyone is embracing plurality. We should understand that if we want to understand right-wing populism. And we can see how this direct impact of pluralization and this direct somehow hesitance towards pluralization has also a direct correlation to anti-immigrant sentiments. So maybe it is that the visible heterogenization through the presence of migrant bodies leads to the idea that to connect migration as the main impact when we talk about pluralization in societies, because it's more physical, it's more manifest. You can see the immigrant. And while talking about Europe as a very plural space, this is not tangible, it's not so much touchable. So the only thing I could say in terms of comparing another proxy would be debates on transgender, because transgender people are also manifest and physically just crossing the borders that we know and just somehow visibilizing plurality as immigrants do too. So we know that if migration is connected to pluralization, and pluralization is connected for a lot of people to discomfort, then we mainly might derive the idea that discomfort is directly connected to migration. And this might a little bit maybe explain why right-wing populism so much is concentrated on the idea of migration, while at the same time rejecting different forms of pluralization too. We know that right-wing populism also rejects the idea of a plural Europe. It also rejects the idea of more than two genders, and it also obviously rejects the idea of transgender and transsexuality. So the connection to right-wing populist parties is the one thing. We all know that they are on the rise throughout Europe, but obviously also in the United States and elsewhere, also in India, And I mean, right-wing populism, I told you, is very much connected to rejecting plural positions. And the idea of plurality is also very much connected to the idea of identity, and very much connected to the idea of a so-called identity crisis. I suppose I mean, the idea of who we are has very much been debated in the 2010 years. Just think about Sarkozy's idea on talking about real French. Also in Britain, we had the real British identity. And in Germany, we had the debates around the book of Thilo Sarrazin. So Angela Merkel in 2016 thought it important to just claim that Germany will remain Germany with all that is dear to us, when in 2015 and 16, nearly 2 million immigrants in a very short amount of time came to Germany. The idea of a huge cultural change and a huge change of population was highly discussed. And I always think it's very interesting, because in the end, the numbers were not as high as we thought them to be. I don't want to downplay it, because actually Germany has accepted the highest numbers next to Turkey in absolute numbers, but still, it still was less than 1% of society coming in the end. So how come that people think that 1% immigrants can change the cultural identity of a country so far that the chancellor seems somehow pressed to come out with a statement like that? And I would be very interested to understanding your thoughts on that, because I always thought a claim like that should have been somehow reasonable when Germany experienced that the highly controversial and actually those debates around the Volkswagen concern and its corruption scandals in the United States, because as Germany, in terms of identity, is very much connected to a so-called reliable actor principle in terms of products, like have the idea of made in Germany in your mind, this narrative of made in Germany, Germany as reliable, as producing the best cars in the world and the best electrotechnical stuff in the world and the best products. So there I would have expected a kind of identity crisis when this self-imagery somehow dropped. But we can see, and you all might be somehow nodding at that moment, when we talk about identity in different countries, it's always connected to the identity of impacted through immigration, if immigration changes the face of the countries or not. So this is also something that has been written a lot about, but I want to just finish this second part of the lecture with this quote of Georg Simmel, who said, "The stranger is not the migrant who comes today and leaves tomorrow, but the one who comes today and stays tomorrow." So maybe it is the idea that I mentioned before, how come that migration is so much connected to changing identities. It is mainly since the debates do not turn so much around like transit migration anymore, but about the idea that immigrants come, they are not guests, they don't leave, they stay, they bring their family, cultures, languages, foods with them, and also their normative ideas of societies and their values. And when they decide to stay, they want to have a say in the making of society. So this obviously is the kind of promise of equality we all know, and this also is something that is obviously comparable. It's not only something that is rooted in the German idea, this promise of equality, but I will show you that this promise of equality is very much a part of modern constitutions all over the world. So I'm just showing you the German constitution, but you might know your own or others, and you know that there are articles concerning equality before the law in nearly every constitutions in the world. And it's not only about men and women being equal, but it's mainly about the idea that no person shall be disfavored because of sex, parentage, race, language, homeland, origin, faith, religious, or political opinions. So this idea of equality and also the idea of pluralization is rooted in the German Grundgesetz. So there is the idea of religious freedom. There is a kind of First Amendment in the German Grundgesetz. It's not an amendment. It's actually very much rooted in the first 20 pillars of the German constitution. So the idea of free speech, which is equal to the idea of plural speech. And if you just look at the first 19 and 20 parts of pillars of this constitution, you can see a lot of ground for pluralization. So pluralization obviously has not been introduced through migration into the idea of the democratic concept of Germany. But still, while there is this very big guiding thought, there is a lot of lack of representation in actually today's Germany. We did a lot of studies on that. I'm not digging deeper into that studies, so this is recorded and all the studies are published online. So if you want to know about them, you just can see the figures and facts there. Just saying that we also did a lot of studies on East Germany, where we compared like East German representation to West German representation, and we compared East German representation to migrant representation, and we could see that both East Germans and immigrants are highly underrepresented in Germany in terms of their actual numbers and in population. So even there is this high also promise towards East Germany, given more than 30 years ago that East Germans equal West Germans. We can obviously see that when we look at their positions in society, they are highly underrepresented, even 30 years after reunification. There's a lot of studies on structural exclusions and these kind of correspondence studies where you hand in kind of comparable things. In that case, handing in, this is a study of colleagues of mine from the University of Mannheim, where they handed in assignments with exactly the same errors and just changed the name. And you could see that the person who was named Max was significantly or systematically graded higher than the same person than the person called Murat, even if the assignments were the same. So as I said, I'm not digging deeper into that. I just want to say that there are a lot of studies on structural exclusions, like teacher expectations being less when students have Turkish names, or exclusions on the labor market depending on the color of your skin or your religion. And we know that applicants with an Asian phenotype and applicants with a Black phenotype would have roughly 40% lower odds to receive a callback than identical whites, even if you have the same summaries. And we also did studies on social, cultural, and emotional exclusions, where we did a so-called vignette study at our institute, framing to people with similar like informations, but we're calling them different, like Ibrahim and Stefan. And we just experimented that when just having everything in terms of integration, like let's say Ibrahim is just finishing high school, doing higher education, working in the city council, or working very much actively with elderly people. Still, if you trigger the information that Ibrahim is a Muslim, or even Stefan is a Muslim, we could see that rates drop down highly from wanting to have these people in your families. So you can just fulfill everything in terms of integration. If you are a Muslim, people don't want you so close to themselves. we could also see that this doesn't change, even though if we feed in a new narrative. During COVID, we all experienced this kind of new narrative where sectors of society suddenly changed to becoming relevant, when before that they were overseen, like working in supermarkets or just being a person who brings you the Amazon deals. Suddenly those people became systematically relevant to societies. And we, during that time, we did a survey because we wanted to understand how many immigrants work in these kind of system relevant sectors. You can see the data here. Sorry, it's not translated, so I'm just going to read you the first sector. The 44% is for cleaning women or men. The second one is for elderly care, and the 34% is already the kind of delivery sector, which was highly relevant for all of us who were in lockdown. We had to heavily rely on the delivery sector to bring in food and other stuff you needed. And all these sectors were, as you can see, over proportionally impacted by migration. But also the third one, 29.5%, was the sector of public transportation, and the 28.7% is the sector of medicine. So these are all sectors where you can see, when we know that 27% of German society are have a so-called migration background, you can see that immigrants were overrepresented in the 5 sectors that I'm showing you here. But also pharmacy is a kind of very high representation. So it's not that immigrants are only overrepresented in lower sectors like cleaning or delivery, but also very much in all of the care sector, medicine, public transportation, and so on. But also having in mind that we could change that into a narrative of utilitarianism. We afterwards surveyed and could see this didn't change very much in terms of acceptance of migration or pluralization. So even though if we dig in or come in with a non-normative aspect, like saying we need immigration, they're good workers, they're good for society, they're relevant, this doesn't change this moment of aversiveness towards migration. While, and I told you before, we even see the contrary. So higher integration scores with higher outgroup mobility threat. We're actually publishing right now a paper on that in JEMS, the Journal for Ethnic and Migration Studies, where we could see that especially when it comes to Muslims, there are certain jobs that society doesn't want them to take. And these are mainly jobs that can shape society. Like they can be positioned in jobs like being doctors or working as vendors or whatsoever. But as soon as it comes to jobs like politicians, judges, even police officers and policemen and women, there is a clearly provable aversiveness towards Muslim taking up these kind of jobs. And we did a kind of experiment a couple of years ago, like I'm not reading all of that, but maybe just the first one. I would feel bad if more and more Muslims got into important leadership positions in the labor market, like 40%, 39% of society would say yes. This goes hand in hand also with education achievements and with demands for equality. So this is a little bit counterintuitive. I told you so, that we would have expected that higher integration would score with higher acceptance, but for now we cannot find that. But what we also can see, and I think this is the last of my empirical studies that I wanted to show you, in the very same thing, we experimented with the idea of normative antinomies. So normative antinomy is the idea that you somehow try to defend a norm while at the very same moment you're acting contra that norm. Like, we ask people to just answer if Muslim rights to demonstrate should be restricted because they don't accept democracy. And you could see we have a more than 40% relatable yes to this item in East Germany, and also 1/3 of West Germans would be accepting to shut down the right to manifestations, to demonstrations, which is one of the ground pillars, as I mentioned before, of democracies. So it's one of the big issues, that you have the right to raise your voice, and you have the freedom of speech, obviously, and the right to manifestations. So if you are accepting to downgrade this right, you're actually somehow attacking one of the main pillars of democracy, while at the same time thinking that you are, or claiming that you are, defending democracies. You can also read the other items yourself, and we can talk about this idea of normative antinomies later. So now coming to the last part of this lecture, the idea of understanding the post and post-migrant societies. So obviously, for those of you who are familiar with the terminology, the post-migrant perspective, or the idea, occurred in a cultural sector, like invented by Shermy Langhoff mainly, or coined very much by her and in her theater. And she had the idea of somehow subversively challenging the idea of immigrants and natives by introducing this idea of post-migrants, those who are in between those moments of hybridization of societies where stories intermingle, narratives connect to each other. And there's a couple of more ideas on the prefix of post, introducing a kind of temporal dimension, which is similar to the post and post-colonial, and the idea that the post-migrant perspective obviously does not seek to depict a state in which migration has ended, but rather it provides a framework of analysis for conflicts, identity discourses, and social and political transformations that occur after migration has taken place. So this idea of after migration obviously is inscribed in this prefix of post, but we do not have to see the post only as a chronological after. It's also a kind of critical dialectical behind, and we can also see it as an aspirational and normative beyond. I'm just elaborating on that a little bit more. So I think if we want to take a post-migrant perspective to analyze societies, we have to have kind of all these three ideas of post in mind. First of all, if you're doing empirical analysis, the most, like, let's say, the easiest thing would just see and have a kind of chronological approach to see how, when immigrants enter a place, a state, a neighborhood, the societal realm changes, and also how the political realm changes. So we worked mainly on the idea that society can be coined post-migrant in the moment when migration is seen and accepted as a political given. So in 2001, German politicians decided to finally coin and name Germany as a country of immigration. So migration politically became inscribed in the constitutional textbooks. And from then on, or in constitutive textbooks. So from then on, the idea of negotiating your right became no more pre-political, morally argument, but a political right. So German society after 2001 has become a kind of push in terms of changing laws, in terms of discussing belongings, in terms of discussing national identity and so on. So the idea of after, when migration has occurred and after it has been politically considered an irreversible factor, is one of the posts in the post-migrant. The other idea would be a critical dialectical approach, and that would be mainly a kind of deconstruction, like depicting underlying conflicts of migration and understanding if that everything that is debated about migration, whether it's really about migration or whether behind that we can see other dominant conflict lines that have turned somehow migration into a meta-narrative. Like we're talking about affordable housing, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about LGBTQ rights, we're talking about anti-Semitism, all connected very much to this meta-narrative of migration. Like we have a huge debate whether anti-Semitism is brought into the country by Muslim immigrants, for example. But the idea of this form of looking behind this post and post-migration would be somehow to deconstruct that idea and dig in deeper into underlying forms of anti-Semitism, sexism, and LGBTQ rights, or debates about transgender and pluralization. And the last one that I've been working with is this idea of a kind of normative ontological approach. So to see whether the post is connected to this promise of equality and whether what societies would need to do in order to get beyond this kind of bipolar composition of the idea of migrants and natives in societies. And we obviously know that the idea of migrant versus natives becomes very much blurring, also demographically, while at the very same time we have a party like the AfD putting very much pressure on providing that bipolar idea with thoughts and making that more factual than they have become through hybridization. So I developed a kind of a model on how post-migrant societies deal with conflicts. And this is a model that is mainly centered, as you can see, centered around the promise of plural democracy in the middle, this promise of equality, this promise that is given also to immigrants and their descendants. And we can see that this promise is somehow negotiated not only by immigrants, not only by immigrant activists, but also with a lot of allies. So, and these allies are not only like, let's say, partners or children or neighbors of immigrants, but also political allies who just have this vision that this promise of equality is something that suits democracies of our times. So the idea of open democracy or open societies is somehow an idea which is fought for not only by immigrants who want these equality for themselves and their descendants, but also together with people who think that this is a kind of USP of democracies. While at the very same time, there is the impression that whenever you fight for a right and you get it coined into a specific law, you can see that there are antagonistic parts of society who try to reverse that law. In terms of, we have that law in terms of like equal rights or understanding migration normatively as a base of Germany becoming a country of immigration. So what's important to know when you want to understand the alliances and the antagonistic parts is that you don't have on the one side immigrants and on the other side natives. You also have antagonists in the immigrant parts, obviously, who reject pluralization. Just think about Salafism, or just think about like right-wing Islamists, for example, who attack pluralism the very same way as like AfD voters would do. So their ideas of reducing pluralization somehow is very similar to each other. So we would put them both in the antagonistic part, while putting in the alliance part also conservatives who have the idea of equality in mind. It's not just a leftist sector versus a right-wing sector. And so we can see that what is negotiated all the time is the factor of acknowledging this plural promise in society. So it's a kind of very dynamic model that empirically also turns to work out. As I said before, we have achieving integration on the one side, and while we have achieved that on the other side, we have those antagonistic sectors who say, well, they should not climb up the ladder more than they did until now. So coming to the last part of the idea of post and understanding whether this post, whether we should work with a like fourth idea of post and understanding migration tomorrow, is to understand whether this post indicates a kind of a new paradigm we're heading towards. And this is very much connected to actual debates that obviously we all know that we're talking about that very much in Germany, but we know that Brexit UK has also experienced a high shortage of skilled workers, Canada experiencing it, France, all the countries, industrial countries in the global north are experiencing shortages of skilled workers, but not only in the global north. So there is a global competition for, let's say, a limited pool of technology workers, but also for a limited pool of care workers, and also for a limited pool of teaching, especially in schools and in kindergarten, all over the world, as societies are becoming older and older. And for the very first time after years, we can see that the global south is also starting to compete for immigrants. Especially we can see a new shift in the Middle East since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Germany has diversified its energy sector highly, and after like more than nearly 1.5 decades of Russia being the main energy supplier of Europe, the Middle Eastern countries are just being targeted again, or becoming more and more important again in terms of energy supply. But hand in hand with that, obviously goes the idea that for years is mainly seen in Saudi Arabia, but also in the United Arab Emirates, where you can see that the idea of becoming a major regional player is very much rooted in like new policy papers, and they have their plans for 2030, 2040 already. And also these plays are building up new islands and becoming international university players. All this stuff is also connected to just improving, and the idea of improving in their policy ideas is also connected to the idea of hiring high-skilled immigrants. So they become a competitor in this sector too, as also like Ghana is becoming a competitor, and Indonesia is becoming a competitor. So it's not only the global north competing for migrants, but as I said before, the global south starts to become an actor too. Only in Germany in 2023, we had like 2 million vacant positions. And we know that because we surveyed this data, we know that by 2036, more than 50% of the public administration workforce is going to retire. So there's a real need for people. And I'm not even talking about high-skilled workers anymore. I'm just talking about people. So who do the work which is needed in mainly every relevant sector in Germany. And when I say relevant sector, I do mean people who work in supermarket, and I do also mean the delivery sector and people who work at airports and in busing stations. So the shortage of skilled workers, you can see it here. I'm not elaborating on that very much, but just maybe to have a look at the top 5 in-demand roles. It's not only IT and data, but it's also like customer facing and front office, And for now, we also see, and now in the US, I can see that very much too, there's also a very high need for just like people working in restaurants, for example. So Germany has to change, as like Canada has already changed its narratives from high-skilled workers to relevant skilled workers. And relevant skilled workers are, obviously, those of you coming from UK know, relevant skilled workers are lorry drivers, nannies, and supermarket vendors too. So there is a talent shortage around the world. I already said that. I said that there is a global average, that there are employers who report difficulty filling open roles from Taiwan to Portugal to China, Hong Kong, and India. It's not only Germany, it's not only the global north. So this decade, we might be experiencing what I'm coined somehow. I'm working with that. I don't know whether you think it appropriate. I call it the migrant gold. So migration might become, within this decade that we're living in, to a kind of resource that people want to have, like they were looking for gold in further times. Still, at the very same time, the attractiveness of the OECD countries for high-skilled migrants is, when it comes for Germany, not as high as we could imagine it to be high. And if the debates, the anti-immigration debates in Europe connected to the new reform and the ideas of closing down the borders in that way continue, the attractiveness might even drop down further. So to conclude, I would just want you, if you think about the post-migrant society, to have in mind that the core conflict in plural democracies evolves around the negotiation of recognition, equal opportunities, and participation. And these are all competed goods, and they are equally claimed by migrants and their descendants. And this is not so much connected to the number of immigrants, it's mainly connected to the awareness that immigrants should have or can demand the same rights. And this idea of them having the same rights and demanding for the same rights, this is what mainly brings in the conflicts, be them 30% of immigrants, be them 10% of immigrants. We know that we have the debates also in countries who do not have those high numbers of immigrants and that Germany has. We know that upward mobility and the emancipation of marginalized groups goes and together with their visibilities leads to demands for recognitions. These demands are normatively promised, but empirically not granted. And this is what we call the high ambivalence in post-migrant societies. We know also, and I showed you that equality alongside freedom is a central promise of modern democracies, and plurality and parity are the main principle. As long as we experience this mismatch, this creates that kind of normative paradox and what I told you, this kind of normative antinomies that lead to somehow destroy democracies and their promises that root in them, not only historically, but also in terms of law and constitutions. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. This is a photo taken from a photograph just beside my house in Berlin, where I live. And maybe those of us who are also following very much what is happening in France, we can relate to these ideas of young people coming together and more somehow rejecting or not believing anymore in the idea of equality and in the promise of equality. And we see that the idea of rejection goes hand in hand with the idea of rejecting the pure form of accepting being German themselves. We also work on these narratives of kind of exclusion or new narratives of self-ethnification. So I'm just changing maybe with that, closing with that image, and we can talk about how the idea of not following this promise of democracy might in the end lead to impacting the whole idea of democracy for everybody and not only for immigrants. Thank you very much.